Thomas Jonathan Jackson was a Virginia gentleman and a brilliant military tactician who became one of the most legendary figures of the American Civil War. Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate general who earned his famous nickname at the First Battle of Bull Run, was born in Clarksburg, Virginia, on January 21, 1824. He came from modest beginnings, far different from many of his fellow Southern officers. He had a difficult childhood marked by tragedy and hardship. Jackson's early years were shaped by loss and struggle, experiences that would forge the iron will and deep religious faith that defined his character. Thomas Jackson's father died of typhoid fever when the boy was only 2 years old, leaving his mother Julia to raise 3 small children in poverty. His mother remarried, but she died in childbirth when Thomas was 7. The children were separated and sent to live with various relatives. Young Thomas went to live with his uncle Cummins Jackson at Jackson's Mill in what is now West Virginia. Life at Jackson's Mill was hard and demanding. The boy received little formal education in his early years, working on his uncle's farm and developing the physical toughness and self-reliance that would serve him throughout his life. Despite his limited schooling, Jackson was determined to better himself through education. In 1842, through persistence and political connections, the 18-year-old Jackson secured an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He arrived at the academy poorly prepared compared to his classmates, many of whom came from wealthy families with access to better schools. Jackson struggled initially with the rigorous academic demands of West Point. He was awkward socially and his lack of preparation showed in his early grades. But Jackson possessed an iron determination and an incredible capacity for hard work. He studied late into the night, often by candlelight after lights out, methodically drilling himself on every subject until he mastered the material. His classmates noticed that while he might not have been the most naturally gifted student, no one worked harder than Thomas Jackson. Jackson's dedication paid off. He steadily improved his class ranking throughout his 4 years at West Point, and by the time he graduated in 1846, he ranked 17th out of 59 cadets. His professors and fellow students believed that if the course had been longer, Jackson would have graduated at the top of his class, such was his trajectory of improvement. Jackson was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army and assigned to the artillery. Within months of graduation, he would face his first test in combat. The Mexican-American War broke out in 1846, and Lieutenant Jackson was sent to Mexico with the American forces under General Winfield Scott. In Mexico, Jackson distinguished himself repeatedly under fire. He showed exceptional courage and coolness in battle, qualities that would define his military career. At the Battle of Chapultepec, Jackson and his artillery unit held their position under withering Mexican fire, providing crucial support for the American assault. Jackson was brevetted for gallantry, promoted for his bravery in combat. The Mexican War gave Jackson invaluable experience in warfare and confirmed his abilities as a soldier. He learned lessons about mobility, surprise, and aggressive action that he would apply with devastating effect years later. After the war ended in 1848, Jackson returned to the United States and continued his service in the Army. He was stationed at various posts, including Fort Hamilton in New York. But peacetime military service did not suit Jackson's temperament and ambitions. In 1851, he resigned from the Army to accept a position as professor at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. Jackson became a professor of natural philosophy and artillery tactics at VMI. His teaching career was not particularly successful. Jackson was a rigid, awkward instructor who taught by rote memorization and could not explain concepts in different ways if students did not understand. The cadets found him peculiar and difficult, giving him unflattering nicknames. But Jackson took his duties seriously and maintained strict discipline in his classes. In Lexington, Jackson also deepened his religious faith, which had been growing since his time in Mexico. He joined the Presbyterian Church and became deeply devout, attending services regularly and teaching a Sunday school class for enslaved African Americans, which was unusual for the time. Jackson's faith became the center of his existence. He believed that God controlled all events and that he was an instrument of divine will. This faith gave him a sense of calm and purpose that would sustain him through the trials of war. Jackson was known for his many eccentricities and peculiar habits. He believed one arm was longer than the other and would hold one hand up to balance his circulation. He sucked on lemons constantly. He refused to eat pepper because he said it made his left leg ache. He sat bolt upright in chairs to keep his internal organs properly aligned. In 1853, Jackson married Eleanor Junkin, the daughter of a local minister and college president. The marriage brought Jackson great happiness, but it ended in tragedy just 14 months later when Eleanor died in childbirth, along with their stillborn child. Jackson was devastated by the loss. He threw himself into his work and his faith, finding solace in prayer and religious study. In 1857, Jackson married again, this time to Mary Anna Morrison, the daughter of another Presbyterian minister. This marriage was happy and enduring. Mary Anna understood and accepted her husband's eccentricities and shared his deep religious convictions. Jackson lived quietly in Lexington through the 1850s, teaching at VMI, attending church, and managing his household. Like many Virginians of his time and class, Jackson owned slaves. He purchased several enslaved people to work in his household. His relationship with slavery was complex and contradictory, like many aspects of his character. He taught Sunday school to enslaved people and expressed belief that slavery was ordained by God but would eventually end according to divine timing. When the sectional crisis between North and South intensified in the late 1850s, Jackson hoped for peace but believed that Virginia's loyalty belonged to the South if war came. He was not a fervent secessionist like some of his fellow Southerners. Jackson loved the Union and had served it honorably in the United States Army. But his loyalty to Virginia was stronger. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, the Southern states began to secede from the Union. Jackson watched these events with concern, praying for peace but preparing for war. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and the Civil War began. Virginia seceded from the Union shortly afterward. Jackson's decision was made. His loyalty was to Virginia, and Virginia had chosen the Confederacy. He would fight for the South. Jackson was commissioned as a colonel in the Confederate Army and ordered to take command at Harper's Ferry, an important strategic point in Virginia. He arrived at Harper's Ferry in April 1861 and immediately began organizing and drilling the raw recruits gathering there. Jackson applied the same methodical, relentless approach to training soldiers that he had applied to his studies at West Point. He drilled his men constantly, imposing strict discipline and demanding absolute obedience. The volunteers, many of whom had expected a short, glorious war, found Jackson to be a harsh taskmaster. But he was transforming them into soldiers. In June 1861, Jackson was promoted to brigadier general and given command of a brigade of Virginia troops. He took his brigade to the area around Manassas Junction, where Confederate forces were gathering to meet the Union Army advancing from Washington. On July 21, 1861, the two armies collided at the First Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the Civil War. The fighting was fierce and confused. The Union forces initially pushed the Confederates back, and the Southern line began to waver. At a critical moment in the battle, Confederate General Barnard B., trying to rally his retreating troops, pointed to Jackson's brigade standing firm on Henry House Hill and shouted, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." B was killed moments later, but his words gave Jackson the nickname that would make him immortal. Jackson's brigade held its position against repeated Union assaults, providing a rallying point for the Confederate forces. The Southern Army counterattacked and drove the Union forces from the field in a chaotic retreat back to Washington. The Confederacy had won its first major victory, and Thomas Jackson had become Stonewall Jackson. The nickname captured something essential about Jackson's character and his approach to warfare. He was immovable in defense, standing firm against any assault. But he was also aggressive in attack, striking like a stone hurled from a sling. After Bull Run, Jackson was promoted to Major General and given command of Confederate forces in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. The Shenandoah Valley was vital to the Confederacy. It was a rich agricultural region that fed the Southern armies, and it provided a protected route for Confederate forces to move north toward Washington. In the spring of 1862, Jackson conducted a campaign in the Shenandoah Valley that became one of the most brilliant military operations in American history. With a force of only 17,000 men, Jackson defeated 3 separate Union armies totaling more than 60,000 troops, preventing them from reinforcing the Union Army threatening Richmond. Jackson's Valley Campaign was a masterpiece of mobility, deception, and aggressive action. He marched his men at a relentless pace, covering vast distances rapidly and appearing where the enemy least expected. His soldiers became known as Jackson's foot cavalry because they could move as fast as mounted troops. Jackson struck suddenly and violently, defeating Union forces in a series of battles including Front Royal, Winchester, Cross Keys, and Port Republic. He used the terrain of the valley to his advantage, moving his army through gaps in the mountains to threaten Union forces from unexpected directions. Jackson kept his plans secret even from his own officers, maintaining operational security and ensuring that the enemy could not anticipate his movements. The Valley Campaign made Jackson famous throughout the South and the North. He became a Confederate hero, celebrated in newspapers and songs. His aggressive tactics and repeated victories boosted Southern morale at a critical time. The campaign also had important strategic effects. By threatening Washington and defeating Union forces in the Valley, Jackson prevented tens of thousands of Union troops from joining the attack on Richmond, helping to save the Confederate capital. Jackson's methods in the Valley became his signature approach to warfare. He believed in rapid movement, surprise, concentration of force at the decisive point, and aggressive attack. He pushed his men hard, demanding force marches and quick movements, but he led from the front and shared their hardships. In June 1862, Jackson brought his army from the Valley to join General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in defending Richmond against Union General George McClellan's massive army. Jackson's performance in the 7 days' battles around Richmond was strangely lackluster. He was late to several battles and seemed confused and lethargic, so different from his aggressive Valley campaign. Historians have debated the reasons for Jackson's poor performance during the 7 days. He was exhausted from the Valley campaign. He was operating in unfamiliar terrain. He was now part of a larger army under Lee's command rather than operating independently as he had in the Valley. Whatever the reasons, Jackson's failures during the 7 days showed that even the great Stonewall was human and fallible. But Jackson redeemed himself in August 1862 at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Lee sent Jackson with half the Confederate army on a wide flanking march around the Union Army under General John Pope. Jackson's force covered 50 miles in 2 days, a remarkable feat of marching, and attacked the Union supply base at Manassas Junction. Jackson then positioned his force along an unfinished railroad cut and waited for Pope to attack. For 2 days, Jackson's men held their position against furious Union assaults, just as they had at the first Bull Run. Then Lee arrived with the other half of the Confederate army and struck the Union flank, routing Pope's army and driving it back to Washington. Jackson's role in the victory was crucial. His rapid march and his stubborn defense set the stage for Lee's devastating counterattack. In September 1862, Lee invaded Maryland, taking the war into Northern Territory. Jackson was given the assignment of capturing the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry. He surrounded the town and forced its surrender, capturing more than 12,000 Union soldiers, the largest surrender of United States forces during the war. Jackson then rushed his troops to Sharpsburg, Maryland, where Lee's army was facing McClellan's much larger Union force. At the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, Jackson commanded the Confederate left flank. His men fought desperately against repeated Union attacks, holding their position in some of the bloodiest fighting of the war. The battle ended in a tactical draw, but Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia. Antietam was the bloodiest single day in American history, with more than 22,000 casualties. After Antietam, Lee reorganized his army, dividing it into 2 corps. Jackson was promoted to lieutenant general and given command of the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. He was now Lee's senior subordinate, commanding half of the Confederacy's premier army. In December 1862, at the Battle of Fredericksburg, Jackson's corps held the Confederate right flank against Union assaults. The Confederates won a decisive victory, repulsing the Union attacks with heavy losses. Lee and Jackson had developed a remarkable military partnership. Lee was the strategic genius who planned the campaigns. Jackson was the aggressive executor who carried out Lee's plans with speed and violence. Lee trusted Jackson completely and gave him wide latitude to accomplish his missions. Jackson trusted Lee's judgment and followed his orders without question. In the spring of 1863, Union General Joseph Hooker led a massive army of more than 130,000 men across the Rapidan River, attempting to outflank Lee's army and destroy it. Lee, with only 60,000 men, faced the greatest crisis of his military career. In a council of war on the night of May 1, 1863, Lee and Jackson planned one of the most audacious maneuvers in military history. They would divide their already outnumbered army, sending Jackson with 28,000 men on a flanking march around Hooker's right flank while Lee held the Union forces in place with the remainder of the army. On May 2, 1863, Jackson led his corps on a 12-mile march through the dense woods of the Virginia wilderness, moving across the front of the Union army. It was an incredibly risky maneuver. If the Union forces had discovered and attacked Jackson's column while it was strung out on the march, they could have destroyed it. But Jackson's march remained undetected. Late in the afternoon, Jackson's corps emerged from the woods on the right flank of the Union 11th Corps. The Union soldiers were resting, cooking dinner, completely unprepared for attack. Jackson ordered his men forward in a devastating assault. The Confederate battle line swept forward with the famous rebel yell, crashing into the surprised Union forces and routing them completely. The 11th Corps collapsed in panic, fleeing through the woods. Jackson's flank attack at Chancellorsville was one of the most successful surprise attacks in military history. But Jackson was not satisfied. As darkness fell, he rode forward with some of his staff officers to reconnoiter the Union positions and plan a night attack to complete the destruction of Hooker's army. Jackson believed that if he could maintain the momentum and keep attacking, he could destroy the Union army completely. As Jackson and his party returned to Confederate lines in the darkness, soldiers from a North Carolina regiment, nervous and trigger-happy in the confusion of the night battle, fired a volley at the approaching horsemen, thinking they were Union cavalry. Jackson was hit by 3 bullets, 2 in the left arm and 1 in the right hand. His horse bolted in panic, and Jackson was struck by tree branches before his aides could control the animal and get him down. Jackson was carried from the field and taken to a field hospital. The surgeon, Dr. Hunter McGuire, examined Jackson's wounds and determined that the left arm would have to be amputated. Jackson accepted this calmly, trusting in God's will. The amputation was performed, and Jackson was moved to a house at Guinea Station, away from the fighting, to recover. Lee sent a message saying, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm," expressing his deep reliance on Jackson. Initially, Jackson seemed to be recovering well. He was weak from loss of blood but in good spirits, confident that he would soon return to duty. But on May 7th, Jackson developed pneumonia, probably contracted while he lay wounded on the cold ground after being shot. His condition deteriorated rapidly. The doctors tried various treatments, but nothing helped. Jackson grew weaker day by day. His wife Mary Anna was brought to his bedside, along with their infant daughter Julia, whom Jackson had never seen. Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes delirious. In his delirium, he gave orders to imaginary troops, fighting battles in his mind. On May 10, 1863, it became clear that Jackson was dying. Mary Anna told him that the doctors said he would not survive the day. Jackson accepted this news peacefully, saying, "It is the Lord's day. My wish is fulfilled. I have always desired to die on Sunday." In his final hours, Jackson spoke of crossing over the river and resting under the shade of the trees, a reference to death and the afterlife. At 3:15 in the afternoon on Sunday, May 10, 1863, Stonewall Jackson died. He was 39 years old. Jackson's death was a catastrophic loss for the Confederacy. He was the South's most successful and feared general, the man who had won victory after victory against superior Union forces. His aggressive tactics and brilliant maneuvers had made him a legend. The news of his death spread grief throughout the South. Soldiers wept openly. Civilians mourned as if they had lost a family member. Lee was deeply affected by Jackson's death, and many historians believe the Confederacy never recovered from the loss. Jackson's body was taken to Lexington, Virginia, and buried in the town where he had lived and taught before the war. Thousands of mourners attended his funeral. The South had lost its greatest warrior. Stonewall Jackson's legacy endures as one of the most remarkable military figures in American history. In less than 2 years of active campaigning, he established himself as a tactical genius whose operations are still studied in military academies around the world. His Valley Campaign remains a textbook example of how a smaller force can defeat larger enemies through mobility, deception, and aggressive action. His flank march at Chancellorsville is considered one of the boldest maneuvers in warfare. Jackson combined deep religious faith with aggressive military tactics in a way that seemed contradictory but defined his character. He was humble and pious in his personal life, attributing all his success to God's will. But in battle, he was fierce and relentless, striking his enemies with overwhelming force and pursuing them without mercy. Jackson's relationship with his soldiers was complex. He drove them hard, demanding forced marches and strict discipline. But they trusted him completely because he won battles and because he shared their hardships and dangers. They called him Old Jack with a mixture of affection and respect. Jackson's influence on the Civil War was profound. His victories in the Valley Campaign and at Second Bull Run helped sustain Confederate hopes in the first 2 years of the war. His partnership with Lee created the most successful command team in Confederate history. His death at Chancellorsville, just as he and Lee had won perhaps their greatest victory, was one of the turning points of the war. Many historians believe that if Jackson had lived, the outcome of the Battle of Gettysburg 2 months later might have been different, and perhaps the course of the war itself. Stonewall Jackson remains a controversial figure, as do all Confederate leaders. He fought to preserve a nation founded on slavery, a cause that history has rightly judged as immoral and unjust. Yet his military genius and his complex character continue to fascinate students of history and warfare. He was a man of contradictions, deeply religious yet a fierce warrior, humble in manner yet supremely confident in battle, awkward and peculiar in social situations yet a charismatic leader of men in combat. Thomas Jonathan Jackson rose from poverty and obscurity to become one of the immortal figures of American military history, a legend known forever as Stonewall Jackson.